So Nahida got announced to rerun in the 4.4 patch, which is coming in a few days. And what I decided to do in this video is I want to go through a bunch of different Dendro teams and archetypes, and then give you my honest opinion on how big Nahida is in these teams. But I'm gonna base this mostly from my in-game experience. So first of all, why am I not gonna use calcs for this? I thought about it, but it's because Nahida is very different from other Dendro characters. Her skill, which is basically most of her kit, it has to be applied per enemy, and what this means is each time you fight a new enemy, like say for example a new wave of enemies spawn in, you have to stop what you're doing and switch back to Nahida to reapply her skill, and then you re-tag enemies. And if you don't do this, then aside from her burst buffs, she basically does nothing to these new enemies. So what does that all mean? How does that relate to calcs? It means unless you're fighting a boss or a single enemy, then honestly you never really do rotations in Nahida teams. There is no real set time for you to switch to Nahida to tag enemies. You basically have to adapt and do it whenever new enemies spawn at the very least. Because of that, I don't know how helpful calculations in this video would be. So if we're happy with that premise, then let's get on with the video. So first of all, let's talk about Nilou Bloom, and I'm gonna put Nahida in the very huge but not mandatory category. And I know in fact many people do consider Nahida basically mandatory just because of how strong she is in Bloom teams, but I wouldn't go that far, and let me explain. So first of all, the positives, why Nahida is so strong in Bloom, and I have this Nilou guide write up which basically covers every small detail. But Nahida is basically the teammate that really lets you play either double hydro or triple hydro depending on whichever one you prefer. And Nahida also basically works in every single role, either mostly off field, either quick swap teams, or even using her on field a lot in like a triple hydro team. And no other Dendro teammate can really do that. No other Dendro teammate really lets you have complete flexibility in Nilou teams with a core like this. Nahida's skill has consistent Dendro application, it has really good range, it has good raw damage, and it also basically lasts forever with this 25-second duration and a very short cooldown. And even that by itself is huge in Bloom teams, especially since you can kind of say that the entire Bloom team premise is pretty much your damage is how much can your team apply Hydro and Dendro onto enemies. And with other Dendro characters like Traveler, Yao Yao, Kole, Kirara, they'll always be lacking in at least one thing, usually multiple things like Dendro application, limited range, energy problems, all sorts of issues. So overall, it's true Nahida is basically the best teammate for Nilou, even more important than other Hydro teammates. And if you do have Nahida, most people almost always use them together. And say for example, if you're going from an all 4-star team, something like this, then replacing one of these Dendros with Nahida is going to be a huge upgrade in basically all situations. But what is the main thing holding Nahida back from being perfect in Bloom teams? It's that same problem with her elemental skill, which is that she needs to mark every new enemy. And with Bloom teams being designed to excel in AoE especially, this can make Nahida's skill issue noticeable. Like, I'm sure Nilou players have experienced killing enemies too quickly in AoE for Nahida to keep up. Her elemental burst also isn't that useful in Bloom teams, since this is only a buff for the on-field character, and in a lot of Bloom teams many of your blooms are coming from off-field characters. In my experience, Nahida's burst is mostly used whenever you have free time, like enemies are spawning or bosses are phase transitioning, but you rarely go out of your way to cast this. So if you don't want to use Nahida, then who is the optimal teammate? And I've covered this team in a few of my guides now, but you could say it's Al-Haytham. Usually Nilou, Al-Haytham, Xingqiu, and then either Kirara, Yao Yao or Baizhu. This team is also pretty good at speedrunning, especially if you have Nilou C2, which not only buffs bloom damage but will also buff Alhaitham's raw damage too. And the strength of this team is that without Nahida, you can just stay on field on Alhaitham and just cleave through AoE fights. It's not the most popular team, obviously Nahida's teams are always going to be more popular, but it's a pretty good team. Is it as flexible, or does it have the most damage potential compared to Nahida Bloom? Probably not, but because this variation does exist, I have to say that Nahida is far from mandatory. And it's not just that, but Nahida Bloom teams are also known for their very high damage floor. And if you don't know, a high damage floor basically means the team will always be dealing pretty good damage even at very low investments or very low skill levels. This is kind of because Nilou's talents basically do so much of the work in Bloom teams. She speeds them up, increases their AoE, increases their damage, buffs the team, and you're always going to have that regardless of the characters you play her with. Obviously it won't be as good as Nahida, especially when you get to single target fights, but like I said, Nilou was designed so that cheap teams like this will still work well. But having said that, if you do play Nilou Bloom or you want to play it in the future, Nahida is extremely recommendable and definitely Nilou's best teammate overall. And if you do want to learn more about Nilou Bloom, I'll put my written guide in the video description. Now let's move on to quicken teams. For example, you might be playing Keqing, Yaemiko, Hanari, Alhaitham, maybe a team that looks something like this. There are a bunch of different quicken teams, but I'll focus on a Keqing team, something like this for now, since I play her the most. And I think I'm gonna put Nahida in quicken, probably very huge but not mandatory, but not for the same reasons as Bloom. So first of all, most of these teams are very quickswap friendly. A lot of these characters, Keqing, Yaemiko, Tainari, a lot of quicken teams have quickswap flexibility, just like Bloom, but they actually do benefit more from Nahida's burst than the average Bloom team. Since unlike Bloom, your on-field character, for example Keqing, will basically always be doing a bunch of quicken reactions, so getting maybe a 250 EM buff is very huge. Honestly, Nahida also deals pretty good personal damage in these teams too, because her own skill can constantly trigger spread, and even electro teammates increasing her skill attack speed. This means overall I think you get arguably even more value from Nahida here in quicken teams, that it's really hard to really complain about the multi-wave AoE issue, although it still does exist. But again, what is Nahida's issue here, and why I don't think she's close to being needed, is that a lot of these optimal high damage quicken teams, they lack defensive utility. Like you can quite clearly see there's no healer or shielder here. And for example, because Fischl does a ton of damage in aggravate teams, you often want her in. And then Kazuha, despite being Animo, he is also able to do quite a lot of quicken boosted damage with his swirls and his electro absorb damage. Yaemiko also works as both an on-field DPS for aggravate, but also can work as mostly an off-field DPS in teams like Tanari or Alhaitham spread teams. So what this means is, if you're trying to fit in all these types of characters and you're trying to fit in Nahida, then you often just don't have room for a healer or a shielder. In practice, the most common way to fit Nahida in is replacing your Kazuha with someone like zhongli. You can see zhongli is very popular in the usage rate surveys. A lot of people play their quicken teams with zhongli, but then you do lose Kazuha's grouping, you lose Kazuha's pretty good damage, and you lose Kazuha's bigger buffs to your electro teammates. So that's kind of the indirect issue with Nahida in most quicken teams, where in order to play the most optimal teams for your DPS, you have to be comfortable without defensive utility, which especially in Abysses these days is not likely for most players. And if you're not comfortable with playing the optimal teams, which is totally fine like I said, but then there's lots of other options. As mentioned, putting zhongli or baiju in these teams is very popular. Or honestly, better yet, you can keep your Kazuha support and you can just replace your Nahida with someone like Kirara or Yao Yao or baiju. Yes, these DENDRO characters damage, their AoE, their buffs might not be comparable to Nahida, but it's better than dying. And for Keqing in particular, I would say playing Kazuha and Fischl is more of a priority than playing Nahida. Keqing really wants Kazuha's grouping and damage buffs, and Fischl synergizes really well with Keqing. Depending on your investment, they can even do similar amounts of damage in single target. And honestly, you can make do with a Kiara for sure, although I don't have it if you do have her C4. So overall, even though Nahida is very strong in quicken teams, no doubt, with all the different on-fielders you might play, whether it's Keqing, Yai Miko, Tainari, Al Haytham, and many others, because most people cannot play these types of optimal defensiveless teams, especially as I said with Abysses these days having very aggressive and hard-hitting enemies, I would say there's many alternatives for Nahida that you could either say Nahida is here or here. I might just change this category to just very strong. Okay, so before we get into hyperbloom, I should add that I barely play Cyno, so I don't want to speak too much about his teams, but from what I know, he has really good synergy with Baizhu. So although you can play both Baizhu and Nahida, Cyno does have quite a lot of other options aside from Nahida, and he might even have overload teams with Chevreuse now. So if you are planning on playing a normal quick swap hyperbloom team, either a double hydro team, something like this, or a double electro team, something like this, or an Al Haytham team, then I'm just going to be honest, I think Nahida is basically just as high as you can get without actually being mandatory. So let's put this as hyperbloom, and the reason is simple. I think not only does Nahida bring all the amazing benefits that she brought in the previous teams, but I think the big difference with hyperbloom is that this team archetype of Dendro, Electro, Hydro, this archetype has very powerful defensive utility and overall role compression. And the perfect example is Shinobu. Shinobu triggers the hyperblooms in your team and also functions well as a healer. And for example, that amount of role compression was missing in quicken teams. In fact, Shinobu has really good synergy with Nahida, and you could argue that these two are the most popular core of hyperbloom teams. And because you're filling so much roles with these two characters, it does leave 2 teammate slots to fill out for the rest of the team, and there's a ton of variation. Like you can do this, you can do this, you can do this, you can add Farina into your teams and Shinobu will heal to help Farina work properly. You could even add pyro characters, you can even add cryo characters. And what's nice is the third character being Xingqiu, he helps with hydro application and he has damage reduction to further help Shinobu with defensive utility. And this by itself is another popular 3-man core which works with a ton of 4th teammates. And I should also say with Hyperbloom, the great thing with Nahida is, again, just like Bloom, Nahida can work as the on-fielder. You can play a more quick swap Hyperbloom team, or Nahida can just work as the off-fielder. She's proven to be very flexible in these teams. Hyperbloom teams just very much value Nahida's strong and consistent Dendro application, since that will help with a constant stream of Hyperblooms and even quicken reactions depending on the team and the situation. And whilst you can play other Dendros, like say for example Traveler here, truthfully it is a big drop off. Of course you don't need Shinobu. For example, you can use an EM Raiden build instead, but even without that role compression, Nahida is still providing great value here. Overall, I think Nahida is just such a priority if you do want to play Hyperbloom teams. You really don't want to miss out on her. You won't regret it, whether you're a casual player or you're a hardcore player, especially as despite there being so much flexibility in Hyperbloom teams, you will almost always see Nahida as one of the options if the player does have her. So lastly, we can talk about burning. So if you think of this or this as the default melt ganyu teams, then Nahida basically works as an alternative pyro applicator to Zhongli. The advantages here is that Nahida, unlike Zhongli, she doesn't have energy problems and she doesn't have range issues. You can just use Nahida's skill, and that combined with pyro application from Bennett or Kazuha allows ganyu to pretty comfortably melt. Ganyu also conveniently benefits from Nahida's burst buff, which can add up to quite a lot of EM. And since Nahida's damage doesn't really matter in these teams, she can also use the 4-piece Tenacity of the Millilith for 20% extra attack to ganyu, along with either Wandering Evenstar or Thrilling Tales for even more attack to ganyu. And overall, that's a ton of extra buffs to ganyu, and it can mean that Ganyu's damage is a lot higher in these Nahida teams than the Zhongli teams. Obviously then that is partially mitigated by losing Zhongli's damage, but there is also a third option, which is where you use Shenhe instead of Zhongli or Nahida. And with Shenhe you basically rely on Kazuha's Pyro Burst Absorption to melt your hits, but Shenhe herself is adding a ton of extra damage increases to Ganyu. I will say though, in my experience, that I play these Shenhe melt teams the least, and they are usually a lot more harder to play than the other two versions, and the executions are a lot tighter. But a Shenhe melt team like this will get more and more popular than the others the more constellations you have. For example, getting C1 or C6 on Ganyu, or getting C1 or C6 on Shenhe, that can make these teams a lot more stronger for high investment speedruns. I think I have to put Nahida as honestly just a side grade. I wouldn't get Nahida just for melt Ganyu teams, especially when a Zhongli team like this has better synergy with zhongli for shielding. I should also add that you need to bear in mind Shenhe and Zhongli are the alternatives for Nahida. You don't really play other Dendros here. Nahida is basically the only viable option, so you're not really comparing Nahida with other Dendros in Ganyu melt. So that's it for the video. Overall, I don't think Nahida is absolutely needed for any one playstyle, though she does come close for a lot. And like I said, you could put quicken either here or here depending on your perspective, but at the moment, because the Abyss is very difficult for most players, I am valuing the defensive utility quite a lot, so I did put it down here in very strong. But I don't think it's a surprise that Nahida is so strong in Dendro teams. That's basically her strength. You could argue that the whole Dendro element was balanced around Nahida, and they basically designed it with Nahida in mind. I know I didn't cover Burgeon in this video, but honestly I don't have much to say on Burgeon. If you're someone who does play a lot of Burgeon teams, then let me know your perspective on Nahida's value in these teams if you want in the comments. Also let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree with parts of this video. Like I said, a lot of people do argue that Nahida is basically needed in nilou bloom teams, but of course some parts are going to be subjective, but I think this does give you a good idea on how critical Nahida is in various teams, and maybe this video does help you decide whether you do want to go for her for the teams you are currently playing or you do want to play. Oh yeah, and I also did start streaming on Twitch recently and it's been going pretty well, so if you are interested in that, then check the link below for my channel. Thanks for watching and stay tuned for more videos.